my name is Trina. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing another monthly wrap-up, my most hectic but also my favorite video to make each month. It's the kind of video where I always say, oh god, I have to make this go faster, this video is gonna be too long, and then it ends up being really long anyways. And today is not gonna be an exception because I read, frankly, a ridiculous number of books in July. Ridiculous for me, that is. I read 22 books in the month of July. Which is not the usual for me. It was the industry holiday time here in Sweden where I live, so lots of lying around in the sun, lots of swimming and then drying off while reading a book. So I got through so many books this summer, but that is not going to be my usual, and in fact I kind of burnt myself out on reading a little bit this month afterwards. I really felt myself on August 1st. I woke up and I was like, oh my god, I don't know if I can read another book right now. I say that, but I think I read an entire book on August 2nd too, so the reading's not over, it's not gonna be like this every month, let's just say that much. But I did love so many of the books I read in July. There are gonna be some duds, there are always some duds, but there are also some new favorites and a lot of just like new, wow, I really enjoyed this, I can't wait to read more from this author kind of books, so we'll get into all that. I will say 2 of the 22 books were rereads that I'm reading for a video project, like a longer term video project I'm working on. So kind of a experimental type thing. So I'm not going to be talking about those books in this video. We just have 20 books to talk about. Totally more manageable, right? But yeah, we have so many books to get through, so I want to dive right in. I have a cup of tea, I have an iced chai too, double teas, double caffeine, so if I start talking really fast, you know why. As usual, my rating system is just me personally. I feel the need to talk about this, especially when there are books that I'm giving lower ratings in a video. I want to make sure I preface it by saying that my ratings are always about like how much I enjoyed a book while I was reading it. It's never me being like, oh, this book is objectively this many stars. It's like, if one thing annoyed me, for example, it can really bring a book down because it would ruin my enjoyment of the reading experience. So always preface with that. In addition, because there are so many books, I didn't want to just talk about them in the haphazard order that I read them in this month. So I've kind of divided them into categories that you can see through the chapters. So if there's a particular genre that's not your cup of tea and you don't really care to hear about books in that genre, feel free to skip, go for it. It's your prerogative as usual. But I've just divided it up a little bit more evenly to make it make more sense to you. And in the process of that division, I will say though, I noticed that I read so many books about witches this month. I don't know, this is like my witch era. I think it was after reading Her Majesty's Royal Coven in June, I just like fell in love with witches. So the majority of the fantasy books I read, all of the fantasy books that I read that were good, in fact, pretty much, were all witch books. So that'll be the first category for the video. I just want to talk a little bit about all of the witchy books I read in July. The first book that I read was kind of more magic, more broadly, but I think it has so many of the components that I love with witchcraft that I'll put it in this category. And that is, I read The Incandescent by Emily Tesh. This is a new release. I think it came out in May, I think. It's a new release for the summer that I was really excited for because I read Emily Tesh's other work, Some Desperate Glory, back in April. And really loved that. Like, thought it was really a unique style and so many interesting, good character writing choices that I just like adored. So I was really excited to pick up another book from Emily Tesh. I really appreciate also that she does one-off standalone fantasies, so they're not like a huge commitment for a big series. And I can say that I absolutely did enjoy The Incandescent. Not as much as I enjoyed Some Desperate Glory, but we'll get into that. The Incandescent is a dark academia-inspired fantasy set at a magic school in England. It is a boarding school for young people, so it's like under 18 type of school. But we're not following the young people, we are following the like head of the school. Dr. Walden is both like a partial professor for some of the older students, but also handles a lot of like the administrative tasks around the school. And to start off, I just found that such a good idea for concept. I'm sure it's been done before, but this was my first time reading a dark academia book from the perspective of a professor. And I really liked Dr. Walden's perspective. Like, she's a very flawed, interesting character. I feel like Emily Tesh is really good at writing those kinds of characters. And from the get-go, she has like this rivalry with another woman on the school campus that I could easily was like, okay, this is gonna get romantic, right? I will say there was lots of sapphic yearning and lots of sapphic middle-aged yearning in this book, which is a new niche that that this book made me fall in love with. We sort of follow Dr. Walden as she first deals with some like long-standing problems for the school with her students that also kind of tie into a personal conflict that she has throughout the story. As with Some Desperate Glory, Emily Tesh kind of writes her books in like arcs. So there'll be like one arc dealing with one problem, one arc dealing with another problem, and that's kind of like pacing may not work for everyone, but I find it really unique and I really enjoyed it. I would say also the setting reminded me so much of A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik in terms of like the magical school kind of has a mind of its own and like has interesting processing on its own that they have to handle that I thought was really cool. Just in general, I think if you like Dark Academia fantasy and you want like a different perspective on it, I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. I will say in the end, we kind of move away from the interesting Dark Academia stuff and fall more into like the interpersonal fantasy elements. Like it's more about Dr. Walden's own problems in the second half versus the first half I thought was really interesting in terms of it brought up stuff with like over-policing of like vulnerable populations like young people and other issues in terms of like what these students are going through and what teachers need to do to support students in this day and age, and I just thought all of that was really interesting. But yeah, it did fall off a little bit in the second half, and I thought it got a little bit chaotic. I did give the Incandescent 4.5 stars. I will say I didn't like it as much as Some Desperate Glory, which is probably more like a 4.75 or even just a 5-star in hindsight. I really did love Emily Tesh's other book, but I did think the Incandescent was really good, and I had a good time with it, and I recommend. The next witch book I read was also another new release. I read A Witch's Guide to Magical Inkeeping by Sangu Mandanna. I read Sangu Mandanna's other book last year, which was, what was it called? Oh, A Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandanna. I loved that book. I think I gave it 5 stars at the time. I absolutely flew through it. I thought it was so, so good. So I was really excited to read more from the author. I knew it was going to be based in a different world, but in general, I don't think I liked A Witch's Guide to Magical Inkeeping nearly as much as I liked Mandanna's first book. This is a book set also in England at a magical inn where the main character, Sarah Swan, brings her aunt back to life in like the first chapter of the book, and in doing so sacrifices both her magical power and her position of power in the magical society in England because she does something that you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to bring people back to life. So, and then we skip forward and then we're following Sarah 15 years later in this magical inn that she still lives in with her aunt and their cozy collection of guests, and she's still trying to figure out a way to get her magic back. And of course this is a romance, so we also bring in the love interest Luke, who comes across the inn in his time of need with his younger sister, Posey. Yeah, the romance is not the biggest part of this book, which I'm glad for because I didn't really care that much about it. If to be honest, I think personally, for those who read this book, I think Sarah and Francesca would have made a way better like romance pairing in terms of like best friends in childhood turned rivals because of like a youthful betrayal, and then like it would have tied in the magical world building part of the story way better if we had Francesca as well. That's my personal take while reading it. Like that's how I felt. I was like this could have been even better if, but I did really like this. But I think I ended up giving it 3 stars. It was like a loving 3 stars. 3 stars, that means I enjoyed it. I just felt like there were some problems with it that probably were more obvious because I was comparing it to Mandanna's first book. The romance wasn't that strong. There were some of the side characters that I really didn't like. I really didn't like Clemmy. I really didn't like the ending. Yeah, I think my greatest impression for this book was just that it felt overcrowded. It felt too full. There were too many side characters. Here, I'll stop rattling my ice around. Yeah, there were just too many side characters running around, too many side plots as well to cover, that I feel like we didn't really get to the heart of these characters, which is like the main thing you want in a cozy fantasy, is like you want to feel really connected to the characters, and I kind of like was lacking some of that. So it gets a loving 3 stars. I had a good time with it. I will absolutely read more from Mandanna. The representation in this book was lovely, and that was like the best part, and I thought it was really well written. But as a book, I would just say I was a little bit disappointed just because I had such high hopes. But that is A Witch's Guide to Magical Inkeeping. The next book was also a disappointment, but probably not a shocking one. I continued my Discworld Witches journey in terms of I read the 3rd Discworld Witches books. I read Witches Abroad by Terry Pratchett. I think this is like the 11th or 12th Discworld book, and the 3rd Witches book, like I said. Still following Granny Weatherwax and still following two of the other characters that were also introduced in Weird Sisters, the last Witches book I read. I listened to Weird Sisters on audiobook back in June. Didn't like it, really disliked the humor, and didn't really care for the plot. But I went into Witches Abroad giving the series one more shot on audiobook because I felt like maybe the audiobook wasn't the best medium, but I was like, I'll try it again because the narrator is really, really good. I just don't think humor fantasy for me translates well into audiobook, which this time we're following Granny Weatherwax and her coven as they travel abroad. And there's a bunch of like satire of like the obnoxious British tourist, except like we're following them. And there's a bunch of satire of like different fairy tales that involve magical beings. It's really hard to explain what didn't work for me here because in general, I thought the humor in this book was much better than Weird Sisters. I thought the writing and the overall plot and arc, I did not feel like with Weird Sisters, I felt like that went on forever. I don't feel like that at all with Witches Abroad. I felt like the pacing made a lot more sense. I really actually enjoyed a lot of things about the story up until the end. So this book did still get 2 stars from me. And I would love to change my mind on this and I would love to have a conversation with people because I've seen no one else. I literally was Googling this for like half an hour and I couldn't find anyone else talking about this. But in this book, there's a point where Terry Pratchett goes out of his way to say in a footnote that racism doesn't exist on the Discworld because everyone is speciesist instead of racist. And I was like, interesting. I don't know why you have to explicitly say that to us, just show it to us in the story. And then it kind of just falls apart for me in terms of then because he brought it up, because I was already thinking about it, I kept on noticing things like the city Genoa that they end up in is kind of being controlled or like gentrified, if I were to use modern terminology for it, by this witch storyline in terms of like she's taking control of it and like forcibly removing cultural aspects from the city and banning them. And then also we get this storyline where voodoo is introduced, like a different type of like foreign magic versus like the magic that Granny Weatherwax practices. And for me, as far as I know about voodoo, just in other fantasy books I've read written by Black authors, it's very heavily tied to a history of the slave trade in terms of it's a practice that came up amongst enslaved people in Haiti. Like it's inspired by African religions, but like because they were forcibly separated from those religions and practices, they had to come up with their own practices and develop. And I feel like that is an important part of voodoo. So I'm like, it's just kind of interesting to introduce it here without any of that context and while explicitly saying that there is no racism and therefore there was no slave trade. But you're talking about a lot of like empires and like locations that wouldn't really exist without the slave trade, which obviously you don't have to bring up in Discworld. There was just a lot weird going on in terms of in this book, much more than the other Discworld books I read. There's so many references to real places, real cities, real cultural practices from our real world. And I was like, I don't love that. I would love this to just be like a fantasy world that kind of exists separately without those elements. And then at the end, Granny Weatherwax has this whole lecture thing where she like lectures one of the black witches that are introduced to us in this story about like how to practice magic and the right way to do it and the right way to get revenge against somebody who's wronged you. And I was like, that feels really weird. I don't want to talk about this for that long. I wrote a really, really long review on Goodreads about this, but I just have seen nobody else mention that. I thought this book was kind of weird for that. I didn't love that. I also think that listening to an audiobook, again, was probably a mistake because I had a lot more time to sit with it and like I was stuck with this audiobook and I was like, oh yeah, like I'm really thinking about this as opposed to just like reading it mindlessly. So I think if I'm going to read more of these Discworld books, I'm going to read the physical copies of them. This was my last attempt at the audiobook. I just don't think this style works for me on audiobook. So I feel the need to talk longer about books that I didn't like to like justify why, but it was a weird book. I wasn't a huge fan. I will continue the series, but as physical, and you'll see on this channel later on in my other monthly wrap-ups if it improves at all. Okay, the next 2 witchy books are 2 books in a series, finishing up a series I started in June, and that is the Her Majesty's Royal Coven series by Juno Dawson. I picked up first, this is a library book, but I have a copy of it. I picked up The Shadow Cabinet, which is the 2nd book in the series, and then I read Human Rites, the 3rd book. but we'll start with the Shadow Cabinet. I can't really give a summary of a second book in a series without spoiling too much, but Her Majesty's Royal Coven, the trilogy, is a contemporary fantasy set in England where witchcraft has always existed, kind of like hidden from human society. Witchcraft and warlocks also exist, but they're much less powerful than the witches. And the conflict between that like nature of witchcraft versus like the modern day bureaucracy of witchcraft is a tension throughout the series that I thought was really interesting. We follow a group of young women who grew up together and are now in their adulthood separated away from each other, dealing with separate issues and conflicts that kind of come to a head with a prophecy in book 1. And book 1 also has a massive, massive cliffhanger at the end that is basically a huge part of the plot in book 2. So I don't want to spoil that cliffhanger whatsoever or that plot twist. So I won't talk about the plot of book 2 and 3, only to say that this book follows a really, really interesting character that I really liked. And I thought the character development was really good and like deep and exciting and nuanced as well, in that way that I love. The same way that in book 1 we had a character who was very nuanced to read about, and I found it really interesting. I think Juno Dawson writes characters that feel like real people so well, so I really liked that part of it. But already in this book 2, I felt like there wasn't as much like I don't know, personal development in the side characters as there maybe could have been, as there was in book 1. So I was already kind of like, okay, but I still flew through this, absolutely loved it, and so I gave The Shadow Cabinet 4.5 stars. After the plot twist at the end of book 1, this book totally could have been a flop to me, and I was actually kind of dreading picking it up. Like, I was like, oh god, what is Juno Dawson gonna do with this? I'm so, like, oh, I don't know how to feel. And I think it was just done perfectly. There were some elements that, like, I still wasn't a huge fan of, which is why it's still not the 5-star, but I kind of became obsessed, so it gets my obsessive boosted rating where I had a really good time with this and gave it 4.5 stars. And then I read the third book in the trilogy, which was Human Rites, which is a new release this month. And I finished the trilogy, and I really like the trilogy overall, but I will say Human Rites was definitely the weakest installment. It was kind of a chaotic conclusion in a lot of ways. In both the ending to book 1 and book 2 in this series, Juno Dawson likes to introduce elements in the last second that can be used to solve all of the problems of the book, and it's kind of like convenient storytelling. And unfortunately, book 3, as the conclusion to the series, kind of just has so many of these conveniences that are introduced that I wasn't a huge fan of. In particular because those conveniences were fantasy tropes that I don't like. Overall, again, no spoilers, but I really didn't like Leonie's storyline in book 3. Just in general, many aspects of it. Still love her character, just didn't like the way her storyline was used to solve the conflict of the book. But I do still love the characters, and I love the resolutions they got, despite how convenient it was. I gave Human Rites 3 stars, I think. Yeah, I gave Human Rites 3 stars. Again, love the series, love these characters, loving 3 stars. Not a very good book on its own, but as part of the series, I love this series. This is a 4-star series for me, and it really, really works, and I'm really happy I read it. Just Human Rites was definitely the weakest installment in it, but I do still really, really recommend Her Majesty's Royal Coven to people who love witch stories, because I think what this series does with covens and relationships between women and sisterhood and those conflicts, really, really good. I'm a fan. This next category are the other fantasy books I read in July, but both of the other 2 fantasy books I read in July were flops for me. Like, I really didn't like them. So this is my fantasy flops category, where I'm gonna have just a teensy bit of a book rant that we'll keep short and sweet, of course. The first one of these books that I read like pretty early on in the month is I finally finished the Ta-wei duology. The book I read was All the Hidden Paths by Fox Meadows, which is the sequel to A Strange and Stubborn Endurance, which I read last year. I liked A Strange and Stubborn Endurance like reasonably well, gave it like 3 stars or something like that. Like, I had a good time reading it. It's a romantasy. This is set in like a separate world in which there are like multiple nations or lands, not at war with each other, but just like in a tentative balance of different cultures. And there's one specific region of those 2 lands that has been like fought over for a long time. In order to bring peace to that region, they decide to marry off I don't know, they have like different titles in this world, but like essentially like what would account as like a duke or like a high noble position. They decide to marry off our main character Vel from one of these lands to a woman from the other land. But in the last second of the marriage negotiations, it's kind of discovered, it's realized that Vel, it prefers men. Vel is gay, like doesn't want to date women. And in this other country that he's going to get married, they are much more accepting than his country is towards gay people. So they're like, oh, you can just marry her brother, this lady's brother instead. Easy peasy. And obviously they fall in love and it's a whole romantasy duology. A big part of the plot in book 1 is that the way it's discovered that he's gay, that Vel is gay, is because he's assaulted fairly early in the book. And the rest of the book, like, definitely read the trigger warnings for this duology if you're going to read it. And the rest of the book is about Vel dealing with the assault and like the way that that affects now his ability to have relationships and trust the people around him. And I thought that part was actually pretty well written in the first book. It's kind of fanfiction-y in terms of like convenience and like writing this in the first place, but I remember having a good time with it and thinking it was pretty well done, which is why book 2 was such a disappointment to me, and I really, really, really wish I had not read All the Hidden Paths. I wish I just read A Strange and Stubborn Endurance and left it alone as a standalone. Why did I read this book? I gave All the Hidden Paths 1.5 stars, which is basically like 0.5 star. Like I don't give things less than 1 star, so I gave this like a 0.5 star. My first 1 star of the year for a very specific reason. Like I said, I thought the first book did the assault storyline fairly well, which makes me really confused as to why the author decided to throw multiple other assaults on other characters. Like, you get to be assaulted, you get to be assaulted. Why? Meadows decides to write this scene where one of the other main characters gets drugged and assaulted by one of the primary secondary characters who gets like a redemption arc. And then, in order to make that redemption arc happen, the character who gets drugged and assaulted basically is like, don't worry, I didn't feel like it was assault, so it's fine. The way that scene was written was so horrific to read. Like, you were reading that like, oh my god, this is horrible. Like, I can't believe this is happening again in this series. Like, what? I know this is like fanfiction-y, but geez, like, why is this happening? And then the character afterwards is like, don't worry, it didn't feel like assault, so it's fine. Oh, I was raging. I don't want to give a long book rant, but yeah, no, this was a 1 star. That was handled so poorly. I also felt like other parts of the plot just like weren't handled particularly well either. There wasn't a lot happening in this book. This book was extremely unnecessary. You do not have to read it. If you want to read A Strange and Stubborn Endurance, just skip the second book. You don't need to read this. The 0.5 stars I did give it were just for Vel and Kai, the main relationship. They were still cute. They were still good characters. I still liked them in this series. But just everything else, didn't like. Yeah, I'll leave it there. That is All the Hidden Paths by Fox Meadows. The next fantasy book I read in July was a little bit better, but still a flop, I would say, for me. That was Valor by Gwynne. This is the sequel to Malice and the second book in the 4-book The Faithful and the Fallen series. I'm really excited to get back to this series and continue working on it. But I will say after Malice, this was definitely a disappointment. This is a epic fantasy series set in like like an island world of like different kingdoms, and it has a massive cast of perspective characters that we're following. Some new ones in Valor, the second book, a lot of the old ones from book 1. And I'll be the first one to say, like, a lot of people don't like Malice, but feel like the series picks up at Valor. I really had a good time with Malice. I didn't think it was the best fantasy book I ever read, but like, I thought it was pretty good. I got attached to all the main characters that I need to get attached to. Versus Valor, my main complaint with this book was the way it treated its women characters and how they were introduced. This bothered me. And also just that it wasn't what I was expecting. Malice was following primarily Corbin, a young boy, as he was like growing up. He was like 13, 14 years old. Now, in the second book, Corbin is like, what, 16, 17 or something like that? And as he grows up, it feels like the story itself is also becoming more mature or adult. And I would say it kind of leaned almost into grimdark in this book. I felt like it was much more gory than book 1. Way more gratuitous torture, like very descriptive torture and character death, which is fine. but there's also a very prominent, very explicit sexual assault storyline. You can see what the theme of these flop fantasies were for me. I was not in the mood to read really explicit sexual assault storylines this month. Yeah, but where we're following both the perspective of the victim and the perpetrator, and it was just horrendous to read. I really didn't enjoy reading it. I didn't feel like the level of description was necessary. I didn't even feel like that storyline was freaking necessary. It was so gross. And that kind of ties into my general complaint with this book, the reason why it gets 2.5 stars for me, despite the fact that I still like some of the overall storytelling bits. I like the battles, the sequences. In the beginning, it was feeling a lot like the Two Towers to me from Lord of the Rings. Like that kind of like adventuring across the countryside, chasing each other, like chasing down armies, chasing down certain people you need to find. And I liked that part a lot. But the women characters that I really liked in book 1 now all of a sudden get romance storylines. This book literally becomes Love Island. Every single person is like, you get a match, you get a match. Oh, we don't already have a pre-existing female character for you to be in love with? Let's introduce a new one. She's a badass and she's just for you. And I was just like... It was just really disappointing. Specifically seeing online that people said that one of their favorite women characters in the series was introduced in this book. I probably know who they're talking about, but she was introduced just to be the love interest of the main character. And yeah, she's cool and she's like has a personality, but I don't see that as like good women representation. If all of your women characters exist to be the love interest to the other male main characters, I don't enjoy that. That brought my enjoyment of this series down significantly, along with the sexual assault storyline. I'm going to continue it. Now I know what I'm getting myself into. I know that this series is going to be just more Love Island shenanigans on a fantasy setting, which is fine. And now I know that and it'll be okay, but yeah, I didn't love Valor. Kind of a disappointment after Malice. Yeah, I thought Malice was good, and it may not have had as many women characters, but like at least the ones that did exist weren't just like tools to the romantic storylines the way that they felt like in Valor. That was the majority of my negative reviews out of the way. So now we can move on just to all the books that I really, really loved in July. Starting off, this was such a good month for romance. I loved all of the romance books I've read, basically. I had a good time with all of them. Yeah, I love, so I'm really excited to talk about them. The first 2 romance books I talk about in detail in my romance reading vlog, so I will just give bare bones discussions here to keep things moving. If you want to hear more about these romance books, I would check out that vlog. The first one was Free from Falling by E.L. Massey that I read at the beginning of the month. This is a romance set in a series of like hockey romance books. Like it's the 4th book in a series, but it's about its own couple. And honestly, hockey barely factors into this book. It follows Matt, a hockey player who falls in love with Sydney, who is a rock musician, a musicianal artist. And it is a very strong like friends to lovers storyline in order to like learn to trust each other first before they fall in love. And like, yeah, I love this book. I thought it was so sweet. I gave it 4.5 stars. Sydney, the main woman love interest, is a trans woman. And that's kind of why there is like distrust in like how this would work in the beginning, and like Matt has to earn her trust in that relationship. And I just thought it was so sweet and wholesome, and I thought it was really great representation as well. It was really well written. Both of their families own ranches for some reason, so there's a lot of like ranch scenery in this book too, if that's like your type of romance book, I would recommend. But yeah, I love Free from Falling. I continue to love the Breakaway series by E.L. Massey. I hope they write more in this world because I really, really liked it. Not perfect because there was a lot going on in this, and I did kind of read this series for hockey romance, of which this book isn't really. So like it's just like weird expectations, but I still really, really liked it. The next romance book I read was Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater, which was another book for that romance reading vlog. I loved Half a Soul, especially the first half, I would say. Adored. It goes in the romance category for me and not in the fantasy category because I felt like the fantasy elements were kind of half-baked, not like my favorite thing on earth, but the romance, man, the romance I loved so much. We are following Dora, who as a young girl had half her soul stolen by one of the Fae, and is now a young woman who has a hard time fitting into this Regency society that she lives in. She's written to a contemporary audience to be coded as autistic, and I feel like that representation is really well done. It was really moving as well, the way that like she claims her own identity and stands up for herself, and just I loved it. And she has a run-in with Elias, a court sorcerer, and they slowly bond over both being like outcasts of society, but also disliking what society stands for and wanting to help people in a more real way. There's a lot of great social commentary in this as well. A little bit heavy-handed, but I still enjoyed it and had a good time. And I did end up giving Half a Soul 5 stars. Probably more like a 4.5 or a 4.75, but if it's at a 4.75, fuck it, we round up. It's a 5-star now. It was the first time I felt really truly giddy over a romance book in like a year. And so because of that feeling, I think it absolutely deserves a 5-star rating. It really brought me back to my joyous romance feels, and I loved it so, so much. But yeah, check out that vlog if you want more information about either of those two romance books. The next romance book I read, I really wish I'd read for that vlog because I would have loved to talk about it in detail, but you'll just have to get a little conversation about it here. I read Book Lovers by Emily Henry. This is only my second Emily Henry book. This book follows Nora, a kind of high-powered New York type who has a job as a book agent that she really enjoys, but it takes up a lot of her time, and has been feeling some distance recently between her and her sister, who she like adores. Their mother died some 10 years before the book started, and they're both clearly still like dealing with their mother's death. So in order for them to kind of rebond, they go on a trip together to this like town. However, in this small town, Nora keeps running into someone that she knows from the city who she didn't realize was from here, Charlie. And the two of them have their own family drama issues going on in the storyline, but they keep running into each other and helping each other with those issues and like bonding with each other over like their shared perspective on the world and their perspective on life. And it just, I loved Book Lovers. Okay, I was so surprised by this because the other Emily Henry I read, People We Meet on Vacation, was so like fine to me, like it just was a contemporary romance. But Book Lovers was so good. I give Book Lovers 5 stars. I sobbed my eyes out at the end of this book. The relationship between Nora and her sister in this book is the highlight of the book as well, but I don't think the romance was lesser than. It was just that like this relationship between the sisters was so well written that it had me absolutely sobbing my eyes out. Like, I'm convinced the only people who don't love Book Lovers are people that don't have a sister. If you have a sister, this is the book for you, because I just like, their relationship was so meaningful, and like the lessons both of them took out of their experiences in the book were so important and meaningful, and the resolution was so good. But then also the romance was incredible because Nora loves her sister and Charlie loves his family, but both of them kind of feel misunderstood by the other people in their life. Like, they are both like high-powered busybody types, but they don't really want to be perceived that way. And it kind of like, Nora loves her sister, for example, but she sometimes feels like her sister can't see her in her entirety. And I feel like it was so perfect the way that both Charlie and Nora to each other filled that last missing piece, that last bit of understanding that both of them were missing in their individual lives. They did that for each other, and I thought it was so good, and I loved it so much. So I love Book Lovers. I highly, highly recommend. I'm really, really happy to love this book. It's a new favorite for sure. The cover, horrendous. Can we get a republished cover of this, please? Nora and Charlie, who are these two people on the cover? That is not Nora and Charlie, okay? But other than that, love this book. And then the last romance book I read in July was near the end of the month. I read The Blue Castle by Ella Montgomery, which is like 100 years old. It's a classic romance by the author of Anne of Green Gables and the lesser known Jane of Lantern Hill, but Jane of Lantern Hill is one of my favorite books of all time by Ella Montgomery, so I was really excited to pick up more works from this author, and I've heard good things about The Blue Castle, one of her only like adult romances. Similar to other Ella Montgomery books, it's set in Canada. There's a lot of descriptions of like Canadian nature, but unlike a lot of her other books, it's not set on Prince Edward Island. It's set kind of like in central Canada, still with an island on a lake though. So there's still an island involved. Where we are following Valency Sterling, who is a young woman who has a very controlling and manipulative family that it's kind of like really evil family, honestly, kind of like cartoon levels of villainy going on in this book. And Valency is 29 years old and unmarried, and she's seen kind of as an old maid by the rest of them and has given up kind of hope in her life when a doctor gives her a diagnosis that she's gonna die within a year. And in that moment, she kind of is like, what am I doing? Like, why am I wasting my life? I only have a year left to live and I haven't even properly lived yet. I'm 29 years old. So she kind of goes on a bender. Not really. Why did I say put it like that? But she runs away from home to go help this young woman who's dying of consumption. And then she runs into this guy who's kind of seen as like a knave by everyone else in the town and falls in love with him. I did enjoy this book. I especially enjoyed the second half. The second half of The Blue Castle feels much more classic Ella Montgomery in terms of these like beautiful descriptions of nature and of balancing this understanding of human nature with actual nature in this like really beautiful way. But I did think the first half was very heavy on the villainous family. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. Loving 4 stars. It's a great, great book. It's a great romance. But I felt like the family... What I like about Ella Montgomery generally is that she has these casts of really, really loving characters, like lovable characters. And I feel like there were almost no lovable characters in this book, which was just like surprising to me. Very unlike her. I still thought it was interesting and I liked it. I don't know why the beginning was so long. Like we don't need, there was just a lot of telling us how evil her family was over and over and over again. I was like, okay, we get it. But the ending was gorgeous, and I did really still like it. So that is The Blue Castle by Ella Montgomery. Okay, the next category is the nonfiction books I read in July, of which there were much fewer this month, I promise. I had a month, one of the months this year, I think, was it like April or March or something, where I read like 8 nonfiction books? What was going on that month? What was happening? Yeah, I read 3 nonfiction books in the month of July. The first one I finished on audiobook was The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. This is a nonfiction book generally talking about de jure segregation. De jure meaning segregation in the law, but like it's still illegal because of the 13th Amendment, but like legal policies by the United States government that led to segregation in housing for Black people in the 20th century. This is an incredibly detailed look, and it's also really, really well written and well paced. And I learned so much from this. I thought it was a really, really good nonfiction. I highly recommend. I gave The Color of Law 4 stars. It's a great, great book. It was a little bit dry over audiobook, a lot of acronyms that were kind of hard to follow in the long run, but the overall points about de jure segregation it was making were like very followable. I thought that part worked out really well, and it's incredibly informative and incredibly important and like devastating to understand why segregation, despite technically being outlawed or, I don't know, like removed by the Supreme Court like 50, 60 years ago, still has an enormous impact on the living conditions for Black and brown people, but especially Black people in the United States because of legal policies by the United States government. And more than anything, this book reads as a case for why we need to take like actions under the law. It's not enough just to be like, oh, these practices aren't allowed anymore. We need to take active policies in order to undo the consequences of these policies had. It's not enough to say, oh yeah, don't discriminate anymore. We have to actively look at what the impact of the previous discrimination was and how to combat it. And Rothstein makes an amazing case. I'm excited to read, I think there's another book that's kind of a follow-up to The Color of Law, talking about what we can do in the 21st century to now undo the stuff that he talks about in The Color of Law. So I would really want to read that. And I thought this book was really, really important. And if you're interested in learning more about US government policies that created housing segregation and inequality in the 20th century, I would highly, highly recommend The Color of Law. The next nonfiction I read was, here she is, a memoir by Jeanette Winterson, one of my all-time favorite writers. I just talked about her in my video last week, talking about my favorite authors. And I actually read this book after filming that video, and once again confirming one of my favorite authors of all time. Jeanette Winterson primarily writes fiction, but this is a memoir by her, The Truth of Her Life, but it's still written in kind of like a very artistic literary style because that's just how she writes. Very like time and space kind of function differently, little segments and snippets of her life in like a really beautiful way. My personal recommendation is read Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, then read this, then reread Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. I guess I should explain. One of Jeanette Winterson's most well-known famous works is Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, published in the 70s, and it's a fictionalized account of her childhood. And then this book is like the actual account, the truth of the matter. Yeah, and I adored this. I gave this book 5 stars. I couldn't not. I tabbed the shit out of it. Jeanette Winterson just has this way of describing the world. Yeah, I know what she's talking about. Like when she's writing, I'm like, yes, exactly. You know, like I have that like connection. I really, really connect to her as a writer. And I think that this book especially feels very cathartic compared to Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. She wrote Oranges when she was like in her 20s. She had just escaped from her like abusive childhood home. And then in this book, she is like she's wrote in 2011. She's a full-grown like woman, and she's still dealing with the after effects of what happened to her in her childhood and working through those elements. Did I even say what the cover of the title of the book is? I'm so sorry. Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal by Jeanette Winterson, her memoir. I really, really love this. A new favorite, absolutely, from Jeanette Winterson. Stunning. Same thing could also be said for the next nonfiction book, which is also in my stack. I finally read, very anticipated for me, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This by Omar Akkad. I also tabbed the shit out of this one, and I also annotated it, detailed page by page. This was a beautiful, beautiful book. This is a nonfiction book. I don't really know how to best describe it. It's about like a kind of like a feeling in a way. That's why maybe the title is so long. It's about this feeling of like, one day everyone will have always been against this. Time and time again in history, we see like horrible things happening to people that aren't powerful Western white people. And then those powerful people say, oh, I'm against this, only after the fact, and refuse to actually take action to help these people when those horrible things are happening. There's partially snippets from Akkad's own life of being like an immigrant from Egypt. His family like fled from Egypt, and the different places he's lived in and the different experiences he's had throughout his life as a journalist. It's kind of about like his process of becoming disenchanted with all of these promises that the West gives people of like freedoms and protections that aren't really available to everyone, are only available to the wealthy and powerful and white people as well. Yeah, and this book specifically is about the current genocide in Gaza and the colonization of the Palestinian people and the way that people talk about it in the media very callously and like very disconnected, as if Palestinian people aren't humans like us, and that like what is causing that disconnect? Well, it's racism, but more than anything, it's like systemic racism. And can you tell? I just can't even describe. But I just think this book is so beautifully written. I would say the overall facts of this are things that most people who are actively following the genocide in Gaza are aware of, and it'll be a lot of like facts that you are familiar with. But the analysis of those facts and the descriptions, I think, are uniquely beautiful. I clearly, okay, I didn't mention this, but obviously I gave this book 5 stars. While I was reading it, I was kind of like, oh yeah, I know this. But afterwards, just like, I just remember like 24 hours after finishing this book, I was just sitting there like, wow. Like it really shifted something in my own conception of my level of responsibility in the world, like your responsibility for fellow human beings. Like you don't have to just get on with your day. You don't have to just get on with your job and your mortgage and your life. When people are dying, it's okay to think about them and mourn them and want to do something for these people. And yeah, I got a lot out of this. I think I could absolutely reread it and get more out of this. I loved it. Very, very meaningful experience. I'm so glad I read this, and I highly recommend it to all people who are really struggling in this moment, or maybe feeling exhausted with the level of helplessness we have for a lot of the horrible things that go on in the world. Yeah, really, really beautiful. I recommend One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This by Omar Akkad. This next category, I guess I put 3 books that I didn't really have any other good genres to put them in. Miscellaneous category, miscellaneous genre. I think it's primarily horror and then 1 literary fiction in this category. I'll start off with the literary fiction. I read Fair Play. I read Fair Play by Tove Jansson. I read it in Swedish, so I read Spel was the title of the book, but in English I think that translates to Fair Play, which is a short literary fiction, a semi-autobiographical work by Tove Jansson about 2 characters, Jan and Marie, who are like adult women artists who do different forms of art, and they share a house. And it's about like, it's just a book that's like kind of doesn't really have a plot, but it's about like little moments in their life together as their like love for each other becomes stronger, and like it's really, really beautiful. I quite liked Spel. I was kind of surprised because like there's nothing really going on in this book, but it's just like a very beautiful, calm look at like sharing a space with another person, a person that you love, and what that is like, and what caring for another person is like. And yeah, I really, really like this book. I gave it 4 stars. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the Swedish as well. I've mentioned this before. I'm a pretty slow reader in Swedish because I can speed read in English, but I can't really speed read in Swedish. I just read at a regular pace. So I was able to sit with this book for a little bit longer and like really absorb it and take it in. And I feel like that was also very meaningful for it. It really worked for me and I really liked it. I really liked Jan and Marie. I loved the descriptions of where they lived on this like island. It was a great book to read during the Swedish summer. I'll say that. Like, it was really, really stunning. So I liked Fair Play. And I would love to reread it again and try to see if I can get more out of it, because I feel like there was a lot to absorb in this book that maybe I just didn't get the first read, but I did really, really like this book. The next book is a horror book that I read. I don't think it's YA horror. I hope it's not YA horror. I'm pretty sure it's adult horror. But I read Chlorine by Jade, which was on my summer TBR. As you can tell from the list, not doing particularly well on my summer TBR plans, but I did get to Chlorine. I actually liked this quite a bit more than I thought I would while I was in the process of reading. This is a book following Renyu, a young swimmer in high school who is obsessed with competitive swimming, but more than anything, she's just obsessed with the water. And that kind of also stems from an obsession she has with mermaids that she's had since she was a young girl. This book kind of deals with the horrors of being a student athlete, the pressures put on you, the borderline like sexual harassment and insane standards of eating also that the coaches put on you. Like, her relationship with this coach in the book is just like, it's really well written. I would say while I was reading it, I was like, this is kind of overwritten a little bit in the beginning, was my first impression, in terms of it's just very like a young person trying to be deep. But as you read on, I kind of was like, 1, I got used to it, and 2, I was like, oh, is that the point? Like, this is a young girl who thinks at a certain point, like, she is a mermaid. From the beginning, she mentions that, like, she is convinced she's a mermaid. And I'm like, wow, this is kind of like, if I was a young girl who thought I was a mermaid, this is also how I would write. So I feel like maybe the writing style, I feel like blended really well into what the point of the book was. And I feel like the ending, also the author committed to the story in the ending in a really great way that I was like, okay, I really like this. So I did end up giving, what did I end up giving? I think I ended up giving it 4 stars. Again, not like a new favorite, but the commitment at the end to the plot of the book and everything like that, I thought was sick. Didn't love the body fluid stuff. It went a bit far. There's a lot of gross moments in this book, but it is like a body horror type of book, so it's fine. But I'm really glad I read it, and I thought the ending was really sick. So it was actually like a surprisingly good book, and that I actually ended up enjoying. So that is Chlorine by Jade. I do recommend this for people who like body horror and also, like me, get annoyed when horror writers don't commit to the horror ending. I feel like Jade commits to the horror ending for this, which you'll see if you read it. And then another horror that I read this month, also another queer horror like Chlorine, was The Z Word by Lindsay King-Miller. The Z Word is a queer zombie book set over a Pride weekend in June. We're primarily following Wendy, who's recently moved to this small town that is hosting a Pride parade recently, a couple years before the book starts. But everyone in their social circle, all of their friends, are slowly turning into zombies that are biting people and infecting them with the zombie curse. This book was like very graphic, very gory, more than I was expecting. But the social commentary of it was also surprisingly good. And low-key, I just think that this book was what I needed it to be when I read it. I gave the Z Word 4 stars. I had just finished, I think, Valor by Gwynne, and I just needed something with, like, interesting female characters, queer characters, a romp, like, a little bit of horror, like, you know, I needed something, like, more social commentary-y, and this book just, like, was that. I read it on my phone in a couple hours. Yeah, I loved all the side characters in this. I enjoyed Wendy as a main character. She's not like a likable main character, but she's an interesting main character. So yeah, this is what I needed it to be when I read it, and that is great. And it has kind of low-key stuck with me. Like, I still kind of think about, like, oh yeah, I read that book this month. That was kind of cool. I had a good time with this, and I do recommend it, especially if you like zombie stories, kind of like unique takes on zombie stories. That is The Z Word by Lindsay King Miller. All right, besties, we're almost done. One more genre category, okay? I wanted to talk about all of the sci-fi books that I read in July. There's only 3. We're so close. We're so close. The first sci-fi book I read was a 3rd book in a series, and I read The Bound Worlds by Megan E. O'Keefe. The Bound Worlds is the last book in the Devoured Worlds trilogy, the sequel follow-up to both The Blighted Stars and then The Fractured Dark, which I've been reading slowly throughout this year, so my reviews for this series are kind of scattered all over the place in my videos. Just as a final take on the series, I really enjoyed it. The Bound Worlds fixed a lot of the things I didn't like about The Fractured Dark in terms of the kind of weird pacing of the story, lots of missing scenes, and overall just way too much of the romance. I feel like The Bound Worlds found a way better balance for those things. But in general, I still didn't like it as much as the very first book in the series, so I gave The Bound Worlds 3.5 stars. I guess I should probably explain to you again in like the 5th video of mine what this series is about. It's a romance sci-fi series set in a futuristic world where there are main ruling families that kind of control different segments of industry and like the elements human beings need to survive. And we primarily follow the Mercator family. We're not following the family. We're following primarily Tarquin Mercator from the family that controls a specific type of metal alloy resource, which the family is mining new worlds for. But there's a lot of discussion about whether or not they're mining it in such a way that is destroying those worlds, which introduces our other main character, Naira, who is like a rebel trying to stop the families from destroying worlds. Tarquin doesn't want to destroy worlds. He doesn't think, he's trying to prove that the family isn't actually doing this to the worlds. They come into contact, they fall in love. The whole series is about the consequences of that. This last installment, The Bound Worlds, is pretty far away from that original plot. There is now like a huge fungal element to the storyline in a really interesting way. Lots of things going on. But the romance is still definitely like the driving force of the plot, which just like isn't my favorite thing, because I'm kind of like, there are so many cool things going on in the series that I'm just like, priorities, please. And also I kind of got my fill of Tarquin and Naira together in book 1 of this series. Book 2 and book 3, I felt like we kept on getting the same dynamic conversations between them that could have been resolved in book 1. But anyways, I would give the series overall 4 stars because I really enjoyed these books and I liked the sci-fi world. I love a fungus, you know me, I love a fungal sci-fi world. So those parts I really, really liked. Overall, I'd say The Blighted Stars is my favorite book in the series, then The Bound Worlds, book 3, and then The Fractured Dark on the bottom. That was The Bound Worlds. Happy to be done with the trilogy. Very content with that. The next sci-fi book I read is from my physical stack. This has been on my shelf for a second now. I finally read The Membranes by Ta-wei, translated by Larissa Heinrich. I got this as a recommendation from Rednote for Taiwanese literature. This is a Taiwanese classic. I don't know, it's from the 90s, from a very specific moment in Taiwanese history, but it is a sci-fi book about a futuristic world where people now live on the floor of the ocean, basically, because the surface of the earth is uninhabitable by humans. And the book starts off with us following Momo, who is a skincare technician on the bottom of the ocean. I low-key ended up loving this book. I really ended up loving this. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. I didn't expect that from the beginning because the writing style is a little bit strange. I don't know if it's just because it's a lesser known book, so the translation isn't perfect, or if it's like meant to be written in this kind of stilted way. Yeah, the writing is just a little bit odd that I wasn't really sure if I would like it, but the ending is so interesting, and like the sci-fi tropes and plot elements that were introduced to in this book, so sick, so cool. I'm so happy I read this. I thought this was so cool. It is also queer, surprise, surprise. As most of my books are, but kind of in that more like philosophical way. Philosophical, is that the right way to put it? But yeah, we get a little bit about Momo's childhood as well, her relationship with her mother. There's so much cool stuff when you get to the end of this book. Now I really want to reread the beginning and try to like see the stuff I missed. But yeah, I don't know. Once again, book came to me at the right time. I'm happy I picked it up when I did because I love this. There's also like an ending section about promiscuous literacy, Taipei punk, and the queer future of the membranes by the translator at the end that gave me some insight to Taiwan at the time this was written in the late 80s, early 90s when martial law was lifted, and like the culture in Taiwan in that time period, which is just really, really interesting because I'm also reading, actually I have it right here. I'm also reading Notes of a Crocodile right now, which is also by a Taiwanese writer, so I feel like this gave me some context for that, surprisingly. So lots of cool stuff in the membranes. I highly recommend it if you like kind of weird sci-fi, because I thought that was really cool what that did. And then the very last book I want to talk about in July, the very last sci-fi book, but the very last book overall that I read is I continued the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells, and I read Rogue Protocol. Rogue Protocol is book 3 in the Murderbot Diaries, still following Murderbot, still following like this overarching longer scale plot based on what happened in book 1, but we get introduced to a new set of characters for this book, like side characters that Murderbot has to work with. I really liked Rogue Protocol. It obviously flew by. I did get pretty attached to the side characters. I like the way that side characters are written in this series, despite having a very short time to get attached to them. I think the author, Martha Wells, does a really good job with making you attached. I still think the first Murderbot book, All Systems Red, is without a doubt my favorite one. I think it had the most internal commentary from Murderbot about itself. Rogue Protocol was also stunning. I think I like Rogue Protocol better than book 2. So far I would say it's All Systems Red, Rogue Protocol, I forgot what the second book is called. Anyways, but that's my order. The ending to Rogue Protocol rips your soul out of your chest. I was so like, I could not believe Martha Wells did that to me. It was really beautiful. Like the lessons that Murderbot takes out of this book, I think will be really impactful in future books. And yeah, I'm really happy to get back to the Murderbot Diaries. I want to pick up book 4 really soon. So, oh, I didn't even give a rating. I gave Rogue Protocol 4 stars. Very loving 4 stars. Great book. I had a good time. Not at the same level as All Systems Red. I feel like I have a hard time rating novellas very highly. I say rating a lot of novellas very highly, but in general, I think there's just like more of a leap in terms of you have a lot to do to get me like super emotionally invested in a shorter amount of time. And I feel like as good as Rogue Protocol is, it doesn't do that quite as well as the first book did. But that is the last book I read in July of the 20 books. This is gonna be such a long video. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for sticking around. I really appreciate it. I couldn't not talk for a long time about these books because I love them so much. I had like nowhere else to talk about them, so I had to bring it up here. So apologies for the long video, but also I'm not sorry. And in general, so many books that I loved, especially I hope you noticed in the second half of this video, like pretty much all books that I love. I think there were only like 3 books that I strongly disliked that I read this month, which is such a win out of like 22 total books. But also I have to get back to work now in August, so it's gonna be more busy. But in general, I really did love the experience of just having like a crazy reading month. It was fun. I needed one of these. I haven't had one of these since like last August in 2024. So it was a good time and I'm very pleased with all of the reading I did. So as usual, if you want more detailed information about any of the books I talked about, please feel free to ask in the comments below. totally fine. Happy to talk about any of these books in more detail. And as usual, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, whatever you want to do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video pretty soon. Bye!